Hello everyone. If you love heartwarming animal stories and want to follow the inspiring journey of these adorable friends, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, let's dive into today's emotional story. Sophie had learned to live in fear. At just 10 years old, she had mastered the art of being invisible. She knew how to hold her breath, how to move without making a sound, and how to brace for the pain before it came. Her home was not a home. It was a place filled with shadows and silence, where every creaking floorboard felt like stepping on glass, where every second of peace could shatter in an instant. She lived in a small, crumbling apartment, tucked away in one of the worst neighborhoods in town. The paint on the walls had long since peeled, and the air always smelled like stale beer and cigarette smoke. And then there was Ray, her stepfather. Ray had entered their lives when Sophie was just 5 years old. At first, her mother had smiled more, seemed happier, and Sophie had hoped that maybe things were getting better. But that hope didn't last. Ray changed. The smiles disappeared. And the yelling began. At first, it was just words, harsh, cruel, meant to break her mother down. Then came the broken plates. Then came the bruises. And then, one day, it was Sophie's turn. She learned quickly, don't fight back. Don't cry. Don't give him a reason. But sometimes, there didn't need to be a reason. She would sit in school, staring out the window, watching other kids laugh, watching them run home to parents who held them, loved them. Parents who weren't like Ray. But no one ever noticed her pain. No one ever asked about the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves. No one cared. Except Lucky. Sophie had found him 6 months ago, hiding behind an old warehouse during a thunderstorm. At first, she had thought he was just a shadow, a forgotten thing left behind like her. But then she saw his eyes, deep brown, filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. He was thin, covered in dirt, his fur tangled and matted. His ribs pressed against his skin, proof that no one had cared for him in a long time. She had crouched down, speaking in a whisper, "Hey there, you're all alone too, huh?" Lucky had hesitated, then taken a slow step forward. And just like that, he became hers. She snuck food out for him every day, using her own meager portions to keep him alive. She cleaned his wounds, whispered to him at night when she couldn't sleep, ran her fingers through his fur whenever the pain of loneliness became too much to bear. Lucky had become her only friend. Her only family. Her only source of warmth in a world that had turned so cold. But safety, Sophie had learned, was always temporary. Because one night, the fragile world she had built collapsed. It started with a slammed door. Then came the yelling, Ray's voice, thick with alcohol, slurring words Sophie couldn't quite make out. She tried to stay small, to disappear, but it didn't matter. His footsteps grew closer, and suddenly, there he was, towering over her, his breath heavy with whiskey and rage. And then the slap. Sophie staggered back, her vision blurred with tears. She didn't make a sound. She had learned not to. But then a growl. Low. Deep. Dangerous. Sophie's heart stopped. She turned her head, her eyes widening as she saw Lucky standing in the doorway. His fur bristled. His teeth bared. his growl vibrating deep in his chest. Ray snarled, raising his fist, but before he could strike, Lucky lunged. Ray barely had time to react before sharp teeth clamped onto his wrist. He howled in pain, stumbling backward, shouting. Sophie froze. This was her chance. Ray was distracted. She had to run. She turned and bolted out the door, Lucky right behind her. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. She kept running. Because if she stopped, Ray would find her. And this time, he wouldn't let her go so easily. Sophie ran until her lungs burned, her feet aching against the cracked pavement. The bitter night air whipped at her face, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Behind her, Lucky kept pace, his paws thudding against the ground, his breath coming out in short, determined bursts. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. He was running for her, with her. The streets were empty. The city was asleep. But Sophie's heart pounded like a drum, drowning out everything else. Where could she go? Who could she turn to? She had no answers. Only fear. She veered into a dark alley, her chest heaving. Lucky skidded to a stop beside her, ears perked, his body tense and alert. Her whole body shook as she pressed her back against the cold brick wall. She was free, but for how long? Would Ray come looking for her? Would he find her? She closed her eyes, trying to push away the thoughts. Lucky nudged her hand. She looked down at him. Even in the dim alley light, she could see the concern in his warm brown eyes. He wasn't just a stray anymore. He was hers. And she was his. Sophie sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. She buried her face in her arms, silent sobs shaking her thin frame. Then footsteps. Her breath caught. She froze. Lucky stiffened, his ears twitching, his body lowering into a defensive stance. The footsteps grew closer. Sophie's heart raced. Had Ray found her? Had someone called him? She gripped Lucky's fur, willing herself not to cry. A shadow moved at the mouth of the alley. Then, a voice. "Hey, kid. You okay?" Sophie's head snapped up. A man stood there, his expression cautious but kind. His face was lined with age, his beard peppered with gray, and his coat looked worn and frayed. A homeless man. For a moment, Sophie said nothing. She just stared. The man's gaze flickered to Lucky, then back to her. "You're running from something, aren't you?" he asked softly. Sophie swallowed hard but didn't answer. The man sighed and crouched down at a safe distance. "I know that look," he murmured. "You don't have to tell me. But if you need a place to rest for the night, there's an old shelter 2 blocks down. Ain't much, but it's warm." Sophie hesitated. She didn't trust strangers. She didn't trust anyone. But then she looked at Lucky, her only friend, the only one who had ever protected her. And Lucky wasn't growling. He was watching the man carefully, but he wasn't afraid. And somehow, that was enough. Sophie nodded. The man's face softened. "All right, Come on then. She stood, her legs wobbly, and Lucky pressed against her side as if to steady her. Together, they followed the man into the night. Underscore 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 underscore. The shelter was little more than an abandoned warehouse, its roof patched with plastic tarps, its doors barely hanging on their hinges. But inside, there were blankets, a small fire in a metal drum, and a handful of other people, men and women with tired eyes and nowhere else to go. Sophie hesitated in the doorway, clutching Lucky's fur. It's safe, the man reassured her. Name's Joe, by the way. Sophie didn't answer. Joe didn't press. Instead, he pointed to an empty corner. You can stay there. Just for the night. Sophie nodded and guided Lucky over. She sat down, pulling an old blanket around her shoulders. Lucky curled up beside her, his warmth pressing into her side. For the first time that night, Sophie let out a slow breath. It wasn't home. But it was safe. And for now, that was enough. Sophie barely slept that night. She lay curled up in the corner of the shelter, Lucky's steady breathing beside her the only thing keeping her grounded. Every creak, every gust of wind rattling the loose metal sheets above made her flinch. She couldn't stop thinking about Ray. Was he looking for her? Was he angry? Her fingers tightened around Lucky's fur. The warehouse was quiet except for the occasional murmur of voices. Joe sat near the fire, sipping from a dented metal cup. The others, men and women with worn faces and tired eyes, were scattered around the space, some asleep, some awake, lost in their own worlds. Sophie felt a strange sense of comfort here, among these people who had nothing yet still shared what little they had. It was more kindness than she'd ever known in that house. But she knew it wouldn't last. She couldn't stay here. Ray would find her. And when he did, he wouldn't just take her back. He'd make sure she never tried to leave again. Lucky's ears twitched in his sleep. Even now, he was alert. Always protecting her. Sophie swallowed hard. She had to leave before it was too late. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the warehouse walls. Sophie sat up, careful not to wake Lucky. Her heart pounded. She had no plan, nowhere to go, but she couldn't wait any longer. Joe noticed her moving. "Leavin' already, kid?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. I can't stay." Joe nodded slowly, studying her. He knew. "You got somewhere safe to go?" She shook her head. He sighed, rubbing his chin. "Figured." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Joe reached into his coat and pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper. "There's a youth center a few blocks from here," he said, handing it to her. "They help kids like you." Sophie stared at the address. Help? She wanted to believe it. But years of pain and fear whispered in her mind help never came. No one cared. Still, she took the paper. Joe didn't say anything else. He just gave her a small, knowing nod. Sophie swallowed hard. Then, she bent down and gently shook Lucky awake. "We have to go, boy," she whispered. Lucky stretched, his tail thumping against the cold ground. But when he saw the look in her eyes, he understood. He always understood. The streets were nearly empty as they walked. The city still waking up. Sophie's stomach ached with hunger, but she ignored it. She had to keep moving. Lucky trotted beside her, his eyes sharp, ears twitching at every sound. He was watching. Protecting. Sophie clutched the paper in her hand. The youth center wasn't far now. Then, a voice behind her. "Sophie." Her blood turned to ice. She froze. Her fingers dug into Lucky's fur as she turned. Ray stood at the end of the street. His face was twisted with fury. His hands clenched into fists. He had found her. Sophie's legs locked in place. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. She was trapped. Ray took a step closer. "You think you can just leave?" His voice was low, dangerous. Lucky growled, stepping in front of Sophie, his body tense, teeth bared. Ray's eyes darkened. "Get rid of that mutt," he snapped. "Now." Sophie shook her head. Ray's jaw tightened. "Fine," he snarled. "I'll do it myself." He lunged. Lucky leapt forward, snarling. Ray stumbled back, caught off guard as Lucky snapped at his arm, forcing him to retreat. The dog's growls were deep, dangerous, his body poised to attack again. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps. This was her chance. She turned and ran. "Stop!" Ray shouted behind her. But she didn't stop. She ran with everything she had, Lucky right beside her. The youth center was close, so close. Her lungs burned. Her legs ached. Then a bright blue sign up ahead. Safe Haven Youth Center. Sophie's heart leapt. She burst through the doors, gasping for breath. A woman at the front desk looked up in shock. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Sophie shook her head violently. "Please," she whispered. "Help me." And finally, someone did. Sophie stood frozen inside the youth center, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her entire body trembled, not just from exhaustion but from fear. Would Ray come after her? Would they believe her? Lucky pressed against her side, his warmth steadying her, grounding her. His tail was low, his ears twitching, still listening for danger. The woman at the front desk, a kind-looking lady with soft eyes and graying hair, rushed toward Sophie, concern written all over her face. "Sweetheart, are you hurt?" Sophie tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Then, the door behind her slammed open. A deep voice boomed. "There you are." Sophie's heart nearly stopped. "Ray." He stood in the doorway, eyes dark with rage, his hand tightening into a fist. He had followed her. Lucky's growl was immediate, low and menacing. His body tensed, ready to lunge. Ray took a step forward. "Come here, Sophie," he said, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We're going home." Sophie felt the old fear creep in. The urge to obey. The instinct to shrink, to make herself invisible. No. Not this time. She clenched her fists and shook her head. "No," she whispered. Then, louder. "No. I'm not going anywhere with you." Ray's face twisted. He took another step forward. "Don't be stupid, girl. You think these people will take care of you? You think anyone will believe you?" But before he could come any closer, someone stepped between them. The woman at the desk, now standing tall and firm. "I suggest you leave," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. Ray scoffed. "She's my daughter. I have every right to take her home." The woman didn't back down. Instead, she glanced toward the security camera in the corner. "Actually, I don't think you do. And if you don't leave now, I'll make sure the authorities see exactly what's happening here." Ray faltered. His eyes flickered toward the camera, then back to Sophie. For a moment, she saw something she had never seen before: hesitation. Then, anger. He spat on the floor, glaring at Sophie. "You're gonna regret this," he hissed. And then, he turned and stormed out. The second he was gone, Sophie's knees gave out. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, shaking. Lucky immediately nudged her, his wet nose pressing into her hands, his whine full of worry. The woman knelt beside Sophie, wrapping a gentle hand around her shoulder. "You're safe now, sweetheart." Sophie wanted to believe that. But after so many years of fear, safety felt like an impossible dream. The next few hours were a blur. A social worker arrived. Then, the police. Sophie was taken to a small office, where she told her story, the whole truth. She spoke about the bruises, the nights spent crying in silence, the fear that had followed her every day. And when she was done, she felt lighter. For the first time, someone had listened. Someone believed her. Lucky sat beside her the entire time, his head resting on her lap, as if reminding her she wasn't alone anymore. When the officer finished taking notes, he looked at Sophie with a small, reassuring smile. "You're very brave," he said. "And we're going to make sure you never have to go back there." Sophie exhaled a shaky breath. No more Ray. No more fear. But then, a new fear crept in. What happens to Lucky?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The social worker exchanged a look with the officer. "Well," she said gently, "usually, dogs without owners are taken to the shelter." "No," Sophie blurted, her heart pounding. "He saved me. He's my family." The woman studied her for a moment. Then, she smiled. "Let's see what we can do." 2 weeks later, Sophie sat on the front steps of a real home. Not the house filled with fear. A real home. The foster family who took her in was kind. They spoke softly, they smiled often. They gave her a room of her own, with soft blankets and a window that let in sunlight. For the first time in years, Sophie felt safe. And best of all, Lucky was there too. It had taken some convincing, but the social worker had pulled some strings. Lucky wasn't just a stray anymore. He was officially hers. As Sophie sat on the porch, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on her skin, Lucky nudged her hand. She looked down, smiling as she ran her fingers through his fur. "You saved me, boy," she whispered. Lucky wagged his tail, his eyes full of devotion. Sophie knew she still had healing to do. Some nights, she still woke up afraid. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had a second chance. And so did Lucky. Message of the story: courage is not always about fighting battles, it's about standing up, even when you're scared. Sophie had spent her life trapped in fear, believing that no one would ever save her. But in the darkest moment, it wasn't a person who protected her, it was Lucky, a stray dog who had nothing yet gave her everything. Lucky wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian, a friend, and a symbol of hope. He reminded Sophie that kindness exists, even in the most unexpected places. And in return, Sophie gave Lucky something just as valuable: a home, a family, and love. This story teaches us that bravery comes in many forms. It's in the child who dares to ask for help. It's in the animal who protects without hesitation. And it's in the people who choose to believe and fight for those who can't fight for themselves. Because sometimes, angels don't have wings. They have 4 paws and a heart full of love.